Wyoming Territory, early spring of 1878, just past sunrise, with the earth still holding the cold of night and the wind rushing wild across the empty plains. The woman stumbled along the railroad tracks, boots scuffed, dress torn at the hem, her dark hair whipping across her face. Her name was Zadie Norwood, and she had not slept in 2 days. Her lips were cracked, her hands scraped raw. She had nothing left but the clothes on her back and a hollow ache behind her ribs. She had been left behind, like something used up and no longer worth the wait. The train had pulled away the day before, her husband on board with 2 tickets and no glance back. Zadie had stood frozen on the platform outside Laramie, clutching a worn bag and the hope that maybe, just maybe, he would change his mind. He had not. Now, somewhere between Laramie and Rawlins, her legs gave out. She crumpled beside the iron rails, the wind tugging at her like it meant to carry her off. Her eyes fluttered, the sky spinning, and then nothing. The sound of hooves came next, steady and close. A man on horseback slowed as he spotted the figure near the tracks, half buried in dry grass. He dismounted quickly, boots crunching gravel. "Ma'am," he said, crouching. His voice was low, steady. "Can you hear me?" She did not answer. He checked her pulse, light but there. Her skin was cold. He looked around, no sign of a wagon, no pack, no one else, just her. He gathered her up, arms strong but careful, and carried her back to his horse. She weighed almost nothing. Zadie woke in a warm room. The walls were rough-hewn pine, the fire crackling low in a stone hearth. She blinked slowly. Her body ached, her throat burned, and her stomach twisted with hunger. A man sat by the fire, sharpening a knife. He had dark brown hair that curled behind his ears and a weathered face that looked like it had seen more storms than most roofs. His shirt hung open at the throat, sleeves rolled, hands calloused. He looked up when he saw her stir. "You are awake," he said, setting the knife aside. "Good. I was not sure if you would come through." Zadie tried to sit up. "Where am I?" "My cabin," he said. "About 8 miles west of the tracks. I found you yesterday." "You were unconscious." She stared at him. "You brought me here?" He nodded. "Name's Nolan Dorsey." She sat back against the pillow, eyes narrowing slightly. "Why did you help me?" He met her gaze. "Because you needed it." Zadie looked away, lips trembling. I do not have anything to give you." "I am not asking for anything," Nolan said quietly. She blinked fast, fighting the burn behind her eyes. He stood. "You need food. I will bring you something." He left the room. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped tight around a ceramic mug. Her appetite was slow, but Nolan had made stew rabbit, potatoes, and onions, and she ate because her body demanded it. "You are not from around here," he said, sitting across from her. "No," she said. "We came from Illinois, my husband and I." His expression did not change. "What happened?" Zadie's jaw tightened. "He left. That much I figured." She looked up. "He bought 2 tickets to California, then told me I was not coming after all. Said he was tired of dragging around dead weight." Nolan's hands curled slightly on the table. Zadie pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "We were married 6 years. I gave him everything." Her voice cracked. "I do not even know who I am now." Nolan's eyes stayed on her. "You are still here. That means something." She looked at him, tears catching the light. "You do not even know me. I know what it looks like when someone has been knocked down and is still trying to stand up." Zadie stared at him for a long time. The next day, she helped him chop vegetables. Her hands were still weak, but the movement steadied her. Nolan worked beside her, silent mostly, except when he asked if she needed rest. By the 3rd day, she was stronger. She watched the way he moved, careful, quiet, like a man used to solitude. He did not ask questions unless he had to. He never pressed her. That night, he brought out a small box of books, old and worn. She picked one up, surprised. "You read?" "When the wind howls too much," he said with a small shrug. She smiled faintly. By the fifth night, she was laughing just once at a joke he made about the stubbornness of his mule, but it felt like something cracked open inside her. He looked up fast, like the sound startled him, then smiled. That smile stayed with her when she went to sleep. A week passed. Then, too, Zadie stood outside the cabin one morning, watching the sun rise over the hills. Nolan came up beside her, a cup of coffee in his hand. "You thinking of going back east?" he asked. She shook her head. "There's nothing for me there." He was quiet for a moment. "You could stay." She looked at him, unsure. "You barely know me." "I know you were strong," he said. "I know you were kind. I know you sit up at night staring at the fire, thinking too loud. I know I want you here." Her breath caught. "I am not asking for anything," he added. "Just, I would not mind if you stayed." Zadie looked down at the cup in her hands. "I do not want to be a burden." "You never were." She looked back up at him then, and something shifted in her chest. She nodded. "All right." That night, they sat by the fire. Nolan handed her a blanket, but she shook her head and leaned against him instead. He did not move for a long moment, then his arm came around her, tentative at first, then firm. Zadie closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Not because she was hidden or rescued or sheltered, but because someone saw her and stayed anyway. The snowmelt had turned the creek restless, its waters murmuring over stone and root as Zadie knelt on the bank, scrubbing linens against a flat rock. The cold bit her knuckles, but her hands moved steadily. Behind her, the cottonwood trees swayed slow in the breeze, newly leafed and bright with the green of early April. Nolan was mending fencing along the pasture, his hammer ringing out in even rhythm. He'd offered to do the wash himself that morning, but she'd shaken her head. She needed the motion, the grit of real work in her fingers. She'd slept through too many days in the past year, waiting for someone else to decide her course. Her name was hers again now. Her voice was too. She'd spoken more in the last week than she had in the last year, and still there were things she hadn't said. That night, after supper, Nolan brought in a pail of warm water and set it beside her chair near the stove. He didn't ask, didn't look for thanks. Just dipped a cloth and gently wrung it out before handing it over. "You got red across your knuckles," he said, sitting on the floor beside her. "Creek's too cold still." She took the cloth, pressing it to her hands. "It's not worse than I've known." Nolan leaned back against the wall, stretching his legs out. "You ever lived near land like this before?" "No," she said. "We were close to the river back home. Flat land. Cornfields. The wind moved through everything like it was brushing its hand over the world." "You miss it." She thought for a moment. "I miss the sound of the frogs at night. My mother used to say they were counting the stars." Nolan smiled faintly. "My father said that was just them trying to outshout each other." She turned toward him, surprised. "You don't talk about your people much." He gave a small shrug. "They died when I was young. Fever took most of the camp. I was raised after that by a rancher near Medicine Bow. He taught me how to ride, mend fence, keep to myself." Zadie studied him. "He sounded like a kind man. He was fair. That's more than most." They sat quiet for a while, the fire crackling low. Zadie watched the way the light danced across Nolan's jaw, catching on the day's growth of stubble. His shirt was damp from the snowmelt he'd worked through earlier, the cuffs darkened to the elbow. "I used to be afraid of silence," she said softly. "He'd come home angry and the house would go still. I thought quiet meant something bad was coming." Nolan didn't look at her, just nodded once. "It doesn't here." She looked down. "I know." Later that week, she found herself at the edge of the small plot behind the cabin, turning over soil with a rusted hoe. Nolan had brought seeds in from town: turnips, carrots, string beans, and said the ground was good for them this year, if the frost held off. She worked in the sun, sleeves rolled, dirt under her nails. He joined her without a word, dropping to his knees beside her with a sack of onions and a look that said he intended to stay until the job was done. They worked in tandem, not speaking much, the rhythm of planting pulling them into something quiet and sure. That night, she stood at the window and watched the stars emerge over the ridge. Nolan came up behind her, close enough she felt the warmth of him, but he didn't touch her. "You ever think of leaving again?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "No. I think of staying. That's different than being stuck." "I know." She turned toward him. "I don't feel stuck." He nodded once, and she saw something shift in his eyes, something careful and steady and waiting. The next morning, she woke to the scent of bread baking. She followed it barefoot to the kitchen, where Nolan stood over the stove, sleeves rolled, apron tied wrong, flour in his beard. "You're up early," she said, smiling. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd try making something that didn't come out of a tin." She leaned against the doorframe. "That's flour on your eyebrow." He wiped at it, missed. "Still there?" "Yes." He gave up and pulled the bread from the oven. It was lopsided, crust split too wide on one side, but it smelled like comfort. "Looks like a boot heel," he said, setting it on the cooling rack. "I've eaten worse." They sat at the table, slicing off pieces with a dull knife, eating in silence. When she looked up, Nolan was watching her, his expression quiet but full. "Zadie," he said, voice low. "I know you've been through more than I can guess. But I want you to know something." She set her bread down. "I don't want you here because you need a place to be. I want you here because I'd rather face every hard day with you than a single easy one without." She stared at him, breath shallow. Then, slowly, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. His hand closed gently around hers. "No promises. No declarations. Just the solid truth of two people choosing one another right there between a crooked loaf of bread and a cabin warmed by shared labor." By late May, the slope behind the cabin bloomed with wild lupin, pale blue and soft in the high light. Zadie sat near the porch steps, stitching a long tear through the knee of Nolan's work trousers. Her stitches were tight, neat, though her fingers bore the faint nicks and calluses of weeks spent mending, planting, tending. A woodpecker tapped somewhere deeper in the trees, and further off, the low bellow of a steer drifted from the hills. Nolan had ridden out before dawn to check the upper pasture, not saying much beyond the usual. He'd be back before dark, and not to wait on supper. She hadn't waited. She'd boiled pinto beans, sliced the last of the cured ham, and set bread dough to rise in the sun-warmed kitchen. But as the sky dimmed and the horse still hadn't returned, her hands had gone still in her lap. When hooves finally approached near dusk, she didn't go out to meet him. She stayed seated, needle paused mid-stitch, and waited for his footsteps on the porch. "I found a calf tangled near the arroyo," he said, standing just inside the doorway as if unsure whether to come further. "Took time getting him loose." She nodded once. "You're back." "I am." She set the trousers aside. "You eat yet?" "No, there's plenty." He crossed the room and she rose to fetch a bowl, but his hand caught hers gently at the elbow. "I didn't mean to worry you." "I know." He let go and she moved to the stove. The silence between them wasn't heavy, it was the kind that came from two people thinking through separate things at the same time. She ladled beans into a bowl and set it on the table with a slice of bread and half an onion, peeled and salted. He sat without a word and ate slowly, like he hadn't realized how hungry he'd been. Zadie stood with her arms crossed, watching the last light fade through the west window. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked finally. He looked up, chewing stopped. "What brought that to you? You've taken me in. Fed me. Shared your land, your time." She turned toward him. "I can't keep taking without giving something back that matters." Nolan set down his spoon. "I didn't do all this expecting you'd marry me. I know. That's what makes it mean something." He leaned back, face unreadable for a moment. "You asking if I'd want that? I'm asking if you'd regret it." "No," she stepped closer. "I don't want to be beholden. But I also don't want to leave." His voice dropped. "You don't owe me your hand to stay. It wouldn't be owing. It'd be choosing." Nolan's eyes found hers then, steady in the dim. "If we do this, it's not for show. Not to keep tongues from wagging or to make the neighbors easy. I'm not afraid of that." He reached for her hand, this time holding it with both of his. "Then we'll do it right. Quiet but honest." They rode into Fort Steele 2 days later, the sky crisp and clear, the river churning with meltwater. The clerk at the small chapel read the vows in a flat voice, but Nolan's hand never left hers, warm and sure. She wore a faded rose-colored dress, the collar pressed clean. He'd combed his hair flat, which made her smile. Afterward, they shared a meal at the boarding house across the street. Fried trout, boiled greens, coffee thick as tar. Nolan said little, but when she reached for his hand under the table, he didn't let go. They rode back slow. That night, as she folded the dress and set it in the chest at the end of the bed, Nolan stood by the open window watching the last of the evening settle over the land. "I never thought to marry," he said. "Not after everything." Zadie came to stand beside him. "Neither did I." He turned to her. "But I'm glad it's you." She rested her head against his shoulder. "So am I." The room was quiet except for the wind moving through the grass and the low creak of branches. The fire had burned down low. Nolan reached to close the window, then turned and drew her into his arms. They didn't speak again that night, not because they had nothing left to say, but because everything worth saying had already been understood. The first June thunderhead crept in slow from the west, heavy and blue-black along the horizon. Nolan stood at the edge of the corral, watching the sky tighten. The air had gone still in that strange way it did before a storm, the kind of stillness that made the birds quiet. He heard the screen door open behind him, the hinges groaning faintly. Zadie joined him without speaking, one hand resting on her belly just above the waistband of her skirt. He looked down at her fingers. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded, eyes on the clouds. 3 weeks late? I know my own body." He didn't answer, just reached to take her hand. It was warm, steady. She glanced sideways at him. "You worried?" "No," he said. "Just thinking how small this place feels now. I don't need a big house." He looked over at the garden, where the string beans had begun to climb the trellis she'd built from scrap wood. "We'll build on. Once the ground dries." She squeezed his hand gently. "I can help. You'll rest. I'll build." The first wind came through then, sharp and sudden, bending the grass flat. Nolan turned toward the barn. "We've got to bring the mare in." Zadie was already moving. "I'll get the feed bucket." They worked quickly, the routine well-worn now, Zadie shaking grain into the trough while Nolan led the mare in and latched the stall. The horses had begun to shiver, ears twitching with the rise in pressure. Once the barn was secured, they ducked back into the cabin just as the rain began to fall. It came all at once, sheets of it loud against the roof. Zadie dried her hair by the stove, toweling it roughly. Nolan bent to stir the coals, then added another piece of pine. The scent of resin filled the room. She sat down across from him. "You ever think about your mother?" He didn't look up. "Not often. She used to sing to me. It's the only thing I remember clear, her voice humming something slow while she combed my hair." Zadie pulled her knees up onto the chair. "Mine taught me to sew. Said a woman ought to know how to make something last." Nolan leaned back on his heels. "You've made more than that here." She tilted her head. "Have I?" He met her eyes. "You've made this place feel like something I never thought I'd have." The rain softened to a patter, and the wind shifted eastward. Zadie stood, crossed the room, and knelt beside him. Her hands rested on his thighs, light but certain. "You want this baby?" she asked quietly. "I want everything that comes with you." She nodded, then leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. They stayed like that until the fire burned low and the room turned shadowed. In the weeks that followed, Zadie began rising earlier, her steps slower but still purposeful. She spent long mornings shelling peas, mending seams, sketching plans for a small cradle. Nolan cleared a patch of land behind the barn for a new addition, leveling the ground with a spade and sweat. One evening, as he measured timber by lanternlight, Zadie leaned in the doorway and watched him work. "You never once asked if I was ready. I figured if you weren't, you'd say so." She stepped onto the porch. "I am." He set the measuring stick down. "If it's a boy, I was thinking of naming him after your father." She blinked at that. "You never met him." "No. But you speak of him like he's still near." She crossed to him, laid her hand on his chest. "His name was Elias." Nolan nodded. Then Elias it is. Zadie tilted her head. And if it's a girl? He smiled, just the faintest curve of his mouth. Then I'll let you decide. She leaned into him, the scent of sawdust and pine on his shirt. Then I'll name her for no one but herself. Behind them, the lantern crackled. Above, the sky had cleared, stars scattered like seed across a wide field. Inside the cabin, the cradle would come together piece by piece. Outside, the land waited, quiet and steady, carrying the promise of new life. The July heat settled heavy across the land, thick with the scent of sage and sun-warmed pine. Crickets rasped in the tall grass, and the air shimmered where it met the dirt road winding past the cabin and into the hills. Zadie stood at the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, the other gently cupping her side. She didn't say anything for a long time, just watched the dust trail rising behind a distant wagon. Nolan came up from the creek, boots damp and hat pushed back. He caught her gaze, then looked toward the road. "Someone you know?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "No," she said, "but they've stopped moving." He squinted into the distance. "Looks like a wheel's failed. You want to go help?" He set the rag down. Already saddled the mule. By the time he reached the wagon, the sun had begun its slow descent. A man stood beside the broken wheel, shirt soaked through and face red from heat. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, sat in the shade beneath the wagon, her eyes wary. Nolan dismounted and tipped his hat. "You headed west?" "Trying," the man said, voice hoarse. "We'll caught a rut and cracked clean through." "Ain't got a spare. You've got anyone close?" The man shook his head. "Left Nebraska in April. Thought we'd find work in Salt Lake. Just me and my daughter now." Nolan studied the break, then looked toward the ridge. "You can shelter with us tonight. We've got a spare beam, might hold long enough to get you to Rawlins." The man hesitated. "You sure? I don't want to be trouble." "You'd be more trouble left out here." They followed him back slow, the girl riding Nolan's mule while her father walked beside. Zadie had already set water to boil and pulled a ham bone from the cellar. She didn't ask questions, just offered a quiet nod when Nolan returned with 2 extra sets of footsteps behind him. That night, the girl fell asleep curled on a quilt beneath the window, a cat tucked beside her. Her father dozed upright in the chair, soot clinging to his sleeves. Nolan stepped outside to cool off, and Zadie followed, the porch boards warm beneath her feet. "Another lost soul," she said softly. "He's trying to do right." She looked up at him. "You always make room for someone who needs it. Don't see a reason not to." He paused. "You think we've got room for more than just passing folks?" Zadie's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He leaned against the rail. "There's an old barn down by the east edge. Roof's worn, but the bones are good. We could clear it, frame out a room. Take in folks who need a place for longer than a night." She studied his face. "You'd want that. I think we could offer something better than just food and a cot." He met her eyes. "You've got a way with people, Zadie. You make them feel like they're seen." Her throat tightened. "I never thought I'd be needed for anything again." "You're not just needed," he said. "You're the reason this place feels like home." She stepped closer, her hand resting at the base of his neck. "Then let's build it. Together." August brought cooler nights and the first hint of golden leaves in the aspens. The girl and her father left with a mended wagon and a basket of dried beans. Word must have spread because a week later, a woman with a limp and 2 sons showed up at the fence with a letter from a cousin in Elk Mountain. Nolan built bunk frames while Zadie taught the boys how to thread a needle and patch their own trousers. By early September, the barn had a new roof. The vegetable plot had doubled and a pair of hens scratched near the porch steps. Every evening, Nolan read aloud from a book someone left behind, his voice low and sure as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Zadie's belly grew heavy with the child and she moved slower now, but her eyes were bright and her hands steady. When the first frost came, Nolan carved a cradle from pine and lined it with wool. She sat beside him as he worked, humming something he didn't recognize. One morning, just before dawn, her hand closed hard around his wrist. "It's time," she said, her voice calm and certain. He stoked the fire and boiled water while one of the women from the barn came to help. The labor lasted from sunrise to near midnight, long and quiet, with only the sound of breath and water and the wind pressing against the shutters. When it was over, Zadie lay spent against the pillows, her skin damp and glowing. Nolan knelt beside her, one hand cradling the tiny girl swaddled in his shirt. "She's got your mouth," he said softly. Zadie smiled, barely a whisper. "And your eyes." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "You did well, my love." They named her Willa. The days grew shorter and the wind took on the scent of snow. The cradle stayed beside the fire, and each night, Willa fell asleep to the sound of Nolan's voice reading old stories while Zadie rocked gently nearby. The barn took in 2 more families before the year turned. One brought sheep, the other tools. They all added something: fences mended, meals shared, laughter rising with the wood smoke. Nolan built a second table and added another bench. Zadie taught the older girls how to preserve root vegetables and hang herbs from the rafters. They never put a sign on the road. Folks just came, and when they did, they found a place already waiting. That winter, as snow fell soft across the roof and Willa slept curled between them, Zadie turned to Nolan and whispered, "I never thought I'd find peace." He pulled her close, his hand resting over hers. "We didn't find it. We made it." And they had. With wood and warmth and work. With silence and kindness. With love that had come slow and sure, built not from rescue but from recognition. They lived the rest of their days on that land, raising Willa, tending the quiet ones who came through, and watching each season fold into the next with steady grace. And every night, as the fire burned low, they leaned into each other and knew, without ever needing to say it again, that they were home.